Good morning, everybody. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have, as always, so many students, alumni, faculty, affiliates, other supporters of ours across the board here. For those that may be joining us for the first time, AHS is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into foreign policy and national security careers imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate first and foremost on college campuses across the country, where our student-led chapters host some of our nation's most eminent scholars and practitioners on U.S. foreign policy for debates with some of their own faculty. And our over 50 chapters host nearly 300 events a year on campus, and our 1,500 alumni are serving across the national security and foreign policy space. If you're interested in learning more, please visit alexanderhamiltonsociety.org and love to connect with you. This morning, it's my really great pleasure to have with us General David Petraeus. General Petraeus is a partner at KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. Prior to joining KKR, he served over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat, including most famously, I think, command of the surge in Iraq, command of U.S. Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following his retirement from the military, he served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency during a critical period of the global war on terror and the establishment of important agency digital initiatives. Over the many, many years, he has been incredibly generous with his time, both to AHS ourselves in particular, but frankly, just with many students and many institutions of learning across the board. We're here to talk about his book as a teacher of history, but he himself, I think, has been a student of history his whole life. And so it's really an honor to have him join us here. And I frankly can't think of somebody more knowledgeable and experienced than him on the subject of today's discussion. I'll hold up the book, which is on his new book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, which was just released 10 days ago, is already, as we were chatting before, New York Times and USA Today bestseller. I would be remiss to not mention that his co-author is also a wonderful historian, Lord Andrew Roberts. And I won't ask who wrote which parts of the book. I'm sure it was a joint labor of love in so many ways. But General Petraeus, thank you so much for doing this, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. It really was a pleasure to work with Andrew. He's a delightful, quintessential Brit and a brilliant historian and biographer. Actually, what he did when we pitched the book to publishers, they asked, how will you divvy this up? And he actually said, well, General Petraeus will write the chapters about the countries that he invaded, plus Vietnam, which is the subject of my dissertation at Princeton, and he would fill in the rest. And you'll see that the Iraq and Afghanistan chapters, when we sent those, I wrote those. When we sent those to the editor came back and said, you should do these in the first person because of the substantial involvement, particularly in Iraq. And that's what we did in the end. And it made it much less awkward than the third person, which is how we submitted them.
Could it be even worse in terms of he wrote about you and you wrote about his own? Well, we won't go down that route. So look, I mean, the book is obviously an examination of modern warfare and in particular how political and military leaders learn or don't learn in some cases from the lessons of warfare. But I figured it's impossible not to start with sort of the ongoing war, which is the surprise attack launched by Hamas against Israel 2.5 weeks ago. And obviously this is still early days, but maybe you could start with that, which is you have a couple big themes or big ideas that you really try and impart through the book. And I was wondering if we could just start by walking us through some of those and how you would apply them to obviously the situation the Israelis are thinking about right now.
So the biggest of the big ideas that emerges from the book is the critical component of strategic leadership that literally determines success or failure in a number of the cases that we evaluate. And by strategic leadership, I'm talking about the leadership at the very top in terms of civilian leadership. So the President of the United States, Prime Minister Thatcher during the Falklands and so forth. And then it's the military commander who is going to oversee the campaign. Not to say that others don't contribute enormously. I mean, you think of the role of General Powell as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Indeed, during the preparation for the Gulf War, the campaign for which was overseen by General Schwarzkopf. But again, often it is that military commander, and they have to perform 4 tasks: the civilian leader at the very top, and then the military commander who is going to turn the big ideas at the civilian leaders, which can be very, very simple. It can be as simple as George H.W. Bush saying at the first NSC meeting on the Saddam's army invading Kuwait, this will not stand. And immediately, with that big idea, a military that still was weighed down by the burdens of Vietnam, not that keen to get into this until they understood a lot more about it and tried to figure out how they could ensure that Powell's rules or Weinberger's rules were observed, which were usually a bar that was much too high to get over in many cases. Then immediately, when he says that, military says, "I got it," and goes about figuring out how to operationalize the big idea of ejecting Saddam's army from Kuwait. So the tasks of a strategic leader are 4 in number. The most important one is to get the big ideas right, to understand the situation with real nuanced, rigorous detail, to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your force, the enemy force, the physical terrain, the human terrain, all the other contextual elements that are present, and then to craft the right strategy. So get the big ideas right. Then a strategic leader has to communicate the big ideas through every means possible to certainly the organization that the individual is leading. Could be a country, it could be the multinational force in Iraq during the surge, but frankly, also to everyone else who has a stake in the outcome of a particular conflict. Then you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That's what you normally think of as leadership. That's the energy, the example. Think of Zelensky on day one. He changes into an OD sweatshirt. He goes to the front lines. It's the inspiration. The communication, again, is part of that. It's how the leader spends his or her time. That is crucial. The battle rhythm, the schedule, because that's how you drive a campaign. George W. Bush establishing with the beginning of the surge, after he picks a new commander and a new ambassador, and says, "I'm going to communicate with you once a week, Monday morning, 7:30 to 8:30, with the entire national security team around the Situation Room table in the West Wing of the White House. I'm going to show your priorities at the start of the week. Hold a meeting at 7:30, which is never done in Washington to begin with. If you look at the president's schedule, it usually starts at 10 or so, or 9:30. Hold it at 7:30 on a Monday morning, and everybody gets the message. And by the way, it was the most unbelievable support imaginable for a commander and an ambassador in the field. By the way, it also started on time and ended on time and went immediately to us. So he had our back in a way that has never, it's totally unprecedented. And again, in my dissertation, I looked at the civil and military relationships during a number of different wars, all the way up through where the mid to 1980s was at the time. And then subsequent to that, frankly, oversaw it personally as the aide to the chief of staff of the army, as a speechwriter for the SACEUR, as the exec for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then actually doing it myself close enough to where I could see how that relationship was evolving. It's also the metrics that are used, which have to be very rigorous. They have to be honest. They have to represent integrity. They're a part of the culture, actually. If the metrics are flawed, you start to erode. And so you look at the flawed metric of Vietnam, which was the body count. It was the wrong metric. Should have had something to do with security of the people. And then that metric became increasingly flawed because of dishonest reporting, and that eroded the actual integrity of the entire effort. Then the final task, which is to sit down formally with events on the battle rhythm that force the commander or the president to determine how to refine the big ideas so that you can repeat the process again and again and again. And if you want to put that in the context of the current situation, think about what are Prime Minister Netanyahu's big ideas so far. What do they seem to be? Big idea number one seems to be that this is the time when Israel has to destroy Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. Not mow the grass down to the dirt this time and then withdraw, destroy. And for a military commander, that means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Keep your eye on reconstitution, because we've learned the hard way, as we recount in the book, if you take your eye off an extremist group like the Islamic State, which had been destroyed during the surge when it was still Al-Qaeda in Iraq and transitioning to the Islamic State, kept them down 3.5 years after the surge, which drove violence down by nearly 90%, pulled a country out of a civil war. By the way, the the surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces. It was the surge of ideas. It was the change in strategy, which was 180 degrees. People talk about change management. It doesn't get any more dramatic than completely reversing what you've been doing, because we recognize that that was failing, even though not everyone acknowledged that as fully as I've just stated it. In this case, again, destruction of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. Now, for a military commander, the big idea that requires is you must destroy Hamas by going literally house to house, building to building, tunnel to tunnel. You are going to have to go through this. This is not something I saw somewhere. A seemingly intelligent individual said, well, they should do it with commando raids and they should do this in precision attacks. That does not destroy Hamas. That does damage. It degrades them. But that's what they have done in the past. This might be more so, but the 5 previous cases, including the 2 where there was actually an incursion into Gaza, did not destroy Hamas. It merely degraded them. And a few years later, of course, they came back and did something worse. In this case, something that is absolutely horrific and barbaric. And let's put this in context again. Let's recall, in the US, we lost nearly 3,000 lives in the 9/11 attacks. 1,400 innocent civilians killed by Hamas, many in a brutal manner, truly barbaric. That would equate to over 50,000 Americans if you compare our population. So 1,400 in a population of roughly 9.3 million people versus ours of 330 million or so. 50,000 lives. And the hostages, 212, equate to over 7,000. So think of that had been inflicted on us, the context. Now, that doesn't mean that, again, the vengeance should drive the strategy. Vengeance or revenge, which we had a desire for as well after 9/11, is not a strategy. You've got to think your way through it. I think the Biden administration has been correct to both unequivocally support Israel, but also to ask some questions about the day after. We learned the hard way. We recount in the book that we made our way to Baghdad. This is when I was a 2-star commanding the Great 101st Airborne Division. And, I asked in Kuwait, excuse me, could you give us a little more detail on what happens after we get to Baghdad and topple the regime? And the retired 3-star deputy of this Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance basically said, you just get us to Baghdad, Dave, we'll take it from there. Well, that post-conflict planning was wholly inadequate, it turned out. And the assumptions that were provided to us also, many of those proved to be invalidated. And then we added to the problems by firing the entire Ba'ath Party down to level 4. Certainly, you got to kill Saddam or his sons. We did, in fact, in the 101st Airborne Division with sons, the other major figures. But when you get down to level 4, you're talking about tens of thousands of bureaucrats, mostly Western educated. Many of them drank. I mean, what more could you want in a partner in a country like Iraq? That we needed to run the country. And yet they're thrown out of their job without an agreed reconciliation process. So there's no hope for them whatsoever, unless you're in the 101st Airborne Division area, where we got a special dispensation from the Coalition Provisional Authority director. Then also we fired the military without telling them how we were going to enable them to provide for their families. So with these 2 decisions, we created hundreds of thousands of individuals who were opposed to the new Iraq rather than supportive of it. That is not a good calculation. In fact, we had on a sign on the wall of the command posts of my units that always asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, you're supposed to go sit under a tree until the thought passes, or to figure out how you can get that operation to end up with a yes answer. By the way, Israel needs to confront this as well. So assuming they do have to destroy Hamas, and you do have to do that by, again, going into the city and progressively, methodically clearing and holding, because keep in mind, you've got to leave forces behind once you've cleared a building so the enemy doesn't re-infiltrate. And ideally, you're actually pushing something that demarcates what it is you're doing. Again, we have lots of experience clearing very, very large areas, especially during the surge in Iraq. Ramadi, several 100,000. Fallujah, we had to do it one final time. People forget. The second one didn't hold. Al-Qaeda was able to take it back over again prior to the surge. And again, very, very methodical. We walled off that entire city, not something you're going to do with Gaza City, sliced it into 12 neighborhoods, cleared each one sequentially, kept them clear, biometric ID cards, control access and egress, all the rest of this. This is the kind of painstaking operation that this requires. It's instructive that the clearance of the city of Mosul, about the size of Gaza, actually perhaps even a little bit larger, of the Islamic State, by the Iraqi security forces, supported by the US, took 9 months. Now, they were slow and deliberate about it, and they don't have all of the capabilities by any means that the IDF have. But again, it gives you some sense of how hard this is and how hard it is going to be, how costly it will be, how destructive it will be, how many civilian casualties there will be inevitably. Israel obviously has to think that through. And they need to provide some other big ideas. A vision for the Palestinians in Gaza needs to be provided, which is what we did for the Sunni Arabs when we were trying to split them away from acceptance or tacit support of al-Qaeda, to say, if you're getting tired of al-Qaeda in your neighborhoods, they're abusive, they're extremist, they're ultra conservative. If you support us as we get them out of your neighborhood and maybe even help us over time, life is going to be better for you. And they did support us. That was called reconciliation. It was the Sahwa, the awakening. We built on that. There was a little example of that. We'd done it actually in Mosul the first year after the de-Baathification as well. But you have to have a vision for them. I have not heard a vision for the Palestinian people in Gaza. And while they're at it, they should provide a vision for the Palestinians in the West Bank as well. Use this horrific, barbaric event as a catalyst to get back to serious discussion. And I'm one of those that sees no alternative to a two-state solution, which is something we can talk about later. But that kind of vision should be part of the big ideas that are laid out, communicated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then actually are implemented over time, noting that if he lays out the two-state solution, he might lose his job. But, so be it. Israel has to come to grips with this particular issue. This should be, again, an enormous wake-up call for the recognition that that has to be addressed. There should also be a vision for who is going to administer Gaza. I know how thorny this is. I recognize, obviously, the Israelis do not want to reoccupy Gaza, but they're not just destroying Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, they're also dismantling, by their announcement, they're dismantling the political wing of Hamas. And that means that the entity that has governed, if you will, seen to the social services and overseen all the bureaucracies and elements within that, is going to be dismantled. What is going to replace it? And again, this is where our lessons, some of them learned the hard way, should be heeded, and there should be very, very explicit and thorough planning about this. Recognizing, I think, I'd love to see the Palestinians come over in a very capable government. Maybe former Prime Minister Fayyad could be persuaded to come back to government or something like that, and there could be support by all the Arab countries that have always expressed concern for the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. But keep in mind that this entity is not just going to provide humanitarian assistance, restore basic services, begin reconstruction and repair of damaged and destroyed facilities. This entity is also going to have a hard edge to it, because there's going to have to be, it should be a civil military counterinsurgency campaign, again, focusing on the stability task, but also on an intelligence-driven effort to ensure that the Islamic State, or to ensure that Islamic Jihad and Hamas cannot come back. There will be remnants. Iran will find those remnants, it will support them, and it will try to enable them to come back and create problems for whatever entity is governing Gaza, and ultimately, therefore, for Israel. Recognizing, again, we should always come back to the founding documents of Hamas, which swear Hamas to destruction of Israel and to killing of Jews. This is not Egypt after the ceasefire in the Yom Kippur War, where President Saad was willing to conduct negotiations with Golda Meir, get back the Sinai, and actually have a recognition of Israel's right to exist in the two countries, et cetera. This is not, the relationship King Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad. Again, post-ceasefire in the Yom Kippur War, where Henry Kissinger, who was actually at a lunch event that was hosted for Andrew Roberts and myself the other day here in New York, and reminded us, all he had to do was fly around to 4 different countries, call 4 different people, and he could actually structure a deal. You can't structure a deal with Hamas. You might have some kind of expedient arrangement with them, as has been the case in the past. But clearly that is not in the cards here. So again, my conclusion is there has to be the destruction of Hamas, which requires complete clearing, holding, and then building, rebuilding of the areas that are cleared of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad.
That was a tour de force across the board. The one question that pops in my mind, something you mentioned early in terms of the series of big ideas, which is metrics. And you mentioned obviously in Vietnam, how we had the wrong metrics. And one of the biggest things that you did in your command of the surge, at your point about change in strategy, was actually coming up with the right metrics to actually measure progress. What metrics would you suggest that we should all look for, that you think the Israelis should use when they do go about doing this? With the concern obviously being that, we've seen the story before, which is they go in, they hit a blow, and the day they pull out, one rocket gets fired, victory gets fired, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I think initially it literally is going to be the progress in clearing and holding areas. Again, recognizing how consuming this is going to be as soldiers. It's not just the casualties they will inevitably take. Urban combat is very tough in that regard. And again, they're fighting against an enemy who doesn't wear a uniform, will drop his weapon and run, will fight from within civilians, will use civilians as human shields, will use the hostages as human shields as well. They're inside this 300-mile tunnel complex, the Gaza Metro. It's an enemy who's been preparing this for months, if not years. There will be suicide bombers, individuals willing to blow themselves up to take Israelis with them. It's pernicious. You have to keep everyone at arm's length as a result. It's very, very difficult when that started to manifest itself during the surge in Iraq in particular. There will be car bombs. There will be improvised explosive devices. There will be rooms rigged to blow up when they enter, booby traps. All of this, again, it cannot be more challenging, I don't think, as a context. And high rises, not just small buildings and so forth. So the challenges are colossal. But again, I think you start just with a focus on clearing and holding. Clearly, there should be a focus on the high value targets. And you're literally Xing them off on a page, and they're doing that already as part of their setting the conditions, preparing the battlefield, and so forth, shaping operations as they're termed. There should be probably a focus. There has to be a focus, in fact, on avoiding civilian casualties to the extent that is possible, even to the extent that, again, some of their soldiers will restrain, this whole courageous restraint idea. Actually, there's a lot to that if you're trying to win hearts and minds, and you are here. By the way, this operation should be approached not as a conventional military operation. Again, it should be a counterinsurgency campaign, because that reminds you of the importance of not just offensive and defensive operations, but stability operations, because in a coin campaign, the stability operations component is much more prominent, and you are concerned about hearts and minds. That was not necessary, say, in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, where it's fought out largely out in open desert, very, very few civilians on the battlefield, didn't have to worry about rebuilding Kuwait or establishing a government or overseeing it, because all you had to do is bring back the Kuwaiti government, which was already established, just needed to be brought back in after Kuwait City and the other areas were secure, had lots of money, could hire contractors. So again, it was almost ideal from the perspective of an operation, especially for the U.S. military that even trained at the National Training Center out in the Mojave Desert. This is the opposite of that. This is, again, the most challenging imaginable. Andrew Roberts and I sat down and asked ourselves, is there any essential battle? Because this is more of a battle than it will become a campaign, but initially this is a battle. Can we think of any battle that was more challenging than this one? And it's very hard to find one. I mean, Hue City, there's some individual during Vietnam or during maybe some of our efforts in Iraq, but this is much, much more so. much tougher enemy, much more experienced, much more prepared. And if you look at the creativity that they demonstrated and the awareness of the Israeli sources and methods of Shin Bet, which is normally upstream and would predict such an attack and ideally interdict it, obviously not the case. And then they blinded the Israeli surveillance systems by taking out the nodes that connect the cameras and the automatic machine guns, all this stuff at the penultimate moment. And of course, chose to do it early on the morning of a Shabbat and a religious holiday to boot. Military readiness was degraded, as was the intelligence capabilities. So that's, again, in terms of metric, you've got to be concerned about civilian casualties. Again, the number one metric for us during the conduct of the surge was civilian casualties. You know, if your number one job is to secure and serve the people, that has to be the biggest. Then it was the incidence of what were called sensational attacks. There was a certain metric for that, a certain level that led to a sensational attack metric. And this was the car bombs, it was suicide vest attacks. For example, in a single day early on, 3 car bombs in 3 separate markets in Baghdad that killed over 150 innocent civilians. You're failing when you see that particular metric come in. So that was, and by the way, the first thing that happened during the surge was civilian casualties did start to go down. Then sensational attacks started to come down. Then our casualties started to come down, although they went up initially because we're inserting our forces right back in the neighborhoods that are the most embattled, putting them right between. We had heat maps that would show us where the Sunni and Shia civil war fault lines were, and we would go right in the center of that. So again, then it's going to become a lot more stability operations. It's going to be restoration of, you'll track megawatts of electricity. You'll track restoration of hospitals, essential services, water treatment plants, all these. We did all of this during the surge as well. I mean, I still can tell you how many megawatts we put on the grid with certain initiatives. I got General Electric to come back. They had left because they'd had some of their workers killed. Then oil production, then getting the electrical towers back upright. I mean, all of this stuff we tracked in enormous detail. And there were metrics for all of it, and there were teams that focused. So you have to get the organizational architecture right to actually address these different issues. That's part of, we got a big idea. We want to restore basic services. Okay, what does that mean? And you have to capture that and then track it. And you have to have elements that will focus on that. You probably need an anti-corruption element while you're at it early on, because there's going to be a huge amount of money coming in and a huge amount of resources, and they're going to need to account for that. So all of these elements are those, but for the time being, it's the progress in actually clearing and holding. And then, by the way, start rebuilding immediately. The minute you're into these areas, you want to demonstrate to the population that's left, this is what Israel's going to do for you, or the international community in support of Israel. So let's get on with getting rid of Hamas. Let's provide a better future for you and your family than you ever could have had under Hamas. And this has been brought on you by Hamas. So the outcry against what Israel's doing right now, put that at the feet of Hamas, because that's what started this particular episode.
So, I mean, we could obviously spend hours just talking about the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. So I want to ask one last question, but use it as a way to transition to some of the broader themes that you in the book. And that is about the rapid change in the nature of warfare. You write in the book that in the period that you guys wrote about, post-World War II, has been the fastest change, the fastest evolution in the nature of warfare than at any other moment, even in human history. And in particular, the two of you write that the last 20 years in the post 9/11 era, it seems to have accelerated even more so. Maybe you could say a little bit first on touching on what you just spoke about, which is what might we see in a potential Israeli counterinsurgency campaign that touches on that? Are there concepts which are different? And then maybe you could talk about how that's played out, I think, in Ukraine, which is really, I think, the motivation for why you and Lord Roberts wrote about the book.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was his idea, again, to provide military context, military history context for what we were seeing in Ukraine. That was the catalyst for writing the book. When it comes to the Israelis, you're going to see a lot of drones. You already are. Again, you're going to see a lot of precision munitions. You're going to see use of a lot of robotics, every kind of unmanned system that they can possibly muster. You'll see, of course, the advanced anti-air defenses that they're already using. Of course, we're going to rush all of our Iron Dome over there. One concern that I do have is the overwhelming of Iron Dome if Hezbollah enters with 150,000 rockets. My sense, though, is that Hezbollah does not want a repeat of 2006, when the Israeli Air Force hammered them much more than we realized at the time. You'll recall, Gabe, I think there was a sense that the Air Force hadn't performed to the expectation. We then reassessed that a few years later. In fact, when I was between the Iraq and Afghanistan tours as a 4-star, when I was at Central Command, we reassessed it and said, wow, there was a lot more damage than we thought. And then we reassessed it again after Afghanistan when I was a CIA director, and so there was even more damage than we thought. And it's pretty clear that Hezbollah doesn't want to revisit that. And that's what Israel would do to them. The idea that you'd invade Hezbollah is nonsensical. There was someone on a news channel the other night that was suggesting that. And I said, you know, Hamas clearing and holding Gaza is going to be more than enough for the IDF. It just consumes soldiers. But you'll see, again, a lot of advanced, I think you could even see, I think we'll see in Iraq, actually, the introduction of very sophisticated counter-drone technologies that are literally just coming off the production line. I don't want to get into more than that, but they're very, very impressive and also very cheap, which is a huge advantage. They're not going to replace Iron Dome. That's for a different type of anti-air, but keep in mind that an Iron Dome interceptor costs $50,000. And if you're using that to take out a drain pipe that that Hamas has lofted in the direction of a city or a kibbutz, and they have to take it down because they're not sure if it's a rocket, that's not a good trade-off. So I think we'll see a lot, but I don't know that this is going to be transformative, because I think in part, you at a certain point in time, after the robots, after the dogs, after everything else you can think of, maybe thermobaric, all the other tools, a soldier is going to have to get in a tunnel and go through it. And you're going to see that same with every building, every floor, every room, every cellar, and again, every tunnel. So in Ukraine, what we are seeing is rapid advance of maritime as well as air unmanned systems. Some of them remotely piloted, but many of them also algorithmically driven. And so in the leap ahead there, I've been there twice in the last 5 months. The progress, even between the visit 5 months ago and then 4 weeks ago, was extraordinary. They have enormous engineering skill, IT skill, and now the press of the battlefield and total mobilization and a lot of international support. And they are just pressing forward when it comes to unmanned systems in a very, very impressive way. There's one other dynamic that has manifested itself in Ukraine that's unprecedented that we will also, and we are seeing actually in the case of Gaza, and that is the transparency on the battlefield. We've always had a fair amount of that. You know, we had embedded reporters during the invasion of Iraq and all the rest. A lot of cameras on the battlefield, but now you have smartphones in the hands of just about everyone. You have internet access, even in a war zone, again, for many of those that are on it. And you have social media platforms onto which you can upload videos and pictures and statements and data and all the rest of that. That gives this a dimension that is much, much more challenging than what we faced, even say during the surge in Iraq, 2007, 2008. Keep in mind, we had a media monitoring apparatus there. We actually had our own organic, uniformed and military Department of Defense civilian assets, but then we augmented it. We hired a British public relations firm, essentially a political campaign organization, because that's what you're doing. We had somebody watching 24/7 every TV channel that covered Iraq. We had people watching all the print media that was coming out, and then listening to every radio station. But at that time, there wasn't much in the way of internet platforms. We didn't have social media, and there weren't smartphones. You had just coming on a digital photography, but nothing like, everybody in his hand having something that could take a video and then upload it very quickly. So this changes, it makes vastly more challenging the issues with which Israel has to deal. And that's even more challenging because there's a predisposition not to believe the Israelis or to blame the Israelis and to take sides against Israel rather than perhaps to be objective. And we saw that, for example, with the case of the supposed Israeli aircraft bombing of a hospital, which supposedly killed 500 innocent Palestinians. It turned out the explosion killed 20. And then it turned out that explosion pretty clearly seems to have been the result of an Islamic Jihad rocket that didn't make it all the way into Israel, but rather came down on top of the hospital. And again, there's nothing that would suggest the kind of bomb blast detonation and impact that you would normally see. The Israelis know what planes are flying. They know who's dropped ordnance. They know where they are when they drop ordnance. And you had the Q-36 radar, the counterfire radar that shows the tracks, which they had to release and show the capacity and capability of these systems, which is really quite impressive. They undoubtedly had other systems that also could confirm that, as do we, all the way into NASA, which has heat signatures and others. If you connect all these dots with both classified and then unclassified imagery and other systems, you can usually figure out what took place. The challenge is that it takes time. And while Israel was putting this all together with help, presumably from the US, the lie goes around the world 4 times while the truth is still clear in its throat, or whatever it is that saying is. And so in many countries and many groups were predisposed to believe the Palestinians. And you saw huge demonstrations, not just in the West Bank and in other Muslim countries in the region, but even on our own streets. So that's another challenge that Israel has. We had big ideas for everything during the surge in Iraq, absolutely everything, including dealing with the press. And the big idea for dealing with the press was be first with the truth. In other words, we want to beat the bad guys to the headline, anticipate what is going to come out, get to CNN's field bureau in Baghdad before the Shia militia does. They have them speed dialed in too. Provide evidence, full motion video, whatever else it may be, that shows that our account is accurate. And again, be truthful and don't try to spin. Don't put lipstick on pigs. If it's a bad day, say it's a bad day. Acknowledge what happened to the best of our ability to provide the truth, and then talk about what it is that we are learning from this, the steps we'll take to mitigate the chances of such a disaster happening again, as we did, for example, in that terrible day that I mentioned, where 3 car bombs went off in 3 markets and killed over 150 innocent Iraqi civilians who were shopping.
I want to ask you about the capability and willingness of leaders to learn and innovate. You mentioned the example you gave.
It varies.
Yeah, well, exactly right. So
there should be a culture of learning. One of the tasks of a leader in overseeing the implementation of the big ideas is to inculcate that, to build it, to reinforce it, to foster it, to insist on it. And you do that in a number of different ways. Number one, you just make it known that you want people to challenge you. I remember when I went back for the surge, I sought out and found a colonel, military intelligence colonel in the Army, who had been thrown out of Iraq in the first few months at the beginning because he said we are facing an insurgency. And the Pentagon did not want to hear that. That word was not being used. He literally was thrown out of the theater. I found him and took him back with me. There was an Army lieutenant colonel who had angered the Army because he'd criticized the intellectual capacity of our generals. They deployed his entire battalion without him, an artillery battalion. Now, to be fair, they were taking pieces of it and not using it for shooting. They were using it for route clearance, for detainee operations and so forth. So it's somewhat justifiable. But I figured out a request for forces that could only be answered by him, got him over there. I want these critics around me. That doesn't mean that you take everything they say. But that's the kind. I brought H.R. McMaster back. He'd been sent off to the IISS for his post brigade command assignment, not the normal assignment. In part because he had a very successful command tour. But he would speak out at times. He didn't leave something left unsaid, as we say. And so I had my arm around his shoulder as a 3-star. We got him back over as a 4-star. I was his senior rater, actually. And then, of course, I sat on the 1-star promotion board, the only one I ever sat on in my life, while commanding the surge, in part to make sure that some of the really thoughtful individuals who were willing to speak out got promoted to 1-star. In his case, after having been looked at twice before. So that's part of it. Then you build it into your meetings. Every division commander conference, we have 2-star and 3-star commanders would go around the table. It was once a month, and everyone had to give 2 big ideas or initiatives that he thought would be relevant to the others. And again, it wasn't optional. This is part of the actual structure of that particular session. Once a month, I met with the heads of the lessons learned centers. So we had the Army Center Lesson Learns, Marine Corps Special Operations, Asymmetric Warfare Group, Counterinsurgency Center. The heads of all of these, there was a process that distilled, and then they would get an hour with me, and they'd lay out lessons that they thought should be learned, or changes to the big ideas, if you will. But of course, the names of their centers are wrong. They weren't centers for Army lessons learned. They were center for Army lessons identified that needed to be learned, but they're not learned until they're incorporated in the big ideas, communicated, and then implemented, and you oversee the implementation of them. So again, it's all about a culture. You'll remember in the field manual that we wrote during my 3- and 4-star tours on counterinsurgency, incredible that 3 or 4 years into Iraq, we didn't yet have a counterinsurgency field manual in our Army. And it said in there, the side that learns the fastest typically prevails in these kinds of irregular operations. And we set out to learn faster than the enemy. That's not universal, though. It depends on having someone at the very top who is willing to be challenged, who wants the intellectual bomb chuckers, right around him, as I did. That didn't mean that I took every single thing that they said and then implemented it or whatever, but it does mean that they make you think through, at the very least, whether your big ideas truly are as powerful, as effective, and as persuasive as you think they are. So you need the people that are willing to tell the emperor that he has no clothes, or that he's scantily clothed.
Well, you didn't say about plug it for you anyways, which is the first answer should have been read your book. Now that but
read the manual.
Yeah, exactly. But anyways, I want to turn to some future scenarios here, which you end the book with a chapter on the future of war, various aspects of that. You talk about open source information and hybrid warfare and psychological operations and so on and so forth. But the question I actually want to ask you about is actually about Taiwan.
Sure.
Which is, I think most Americans, if they are thinking about this, which they probably aren't thinking about it enough, if they think about a scenario, I think in their mind, they have almost like a Operation Overlord D-Day like, scenario, which is the Chinese will launch an aerial campaign to soften up Taiwan and do a cross strait amphibious landing, and then try and actually conquer. I mean, really, the images it evokes is literally of D-Day nearly 80 years ago. But that may not be, let alone the most likely scenario, but it may not be a scenario at all. And so I'm curious how you look at that potential conflict and how you think about the lessons and the big ideas and the future of war that you lay out in the book versus this sort of traditional way that I think many people think about it.
So first of all, I think you start with just revisiting deterrence and recognizing that deterrence is a function of a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. And so we have to make sure that those capabilities are robust, modern, being transformed all the time, and that there's no question about our willingness to employ them. And by the way, another big theme in the book is that everything in the world is connected. And if you have a red line that's not a red line in Syria, it reverberates out in the Indo-Pacific region. In fact, Prime Minister Lee of Singapore, I was meeting with him when that happened, and he said, General, that actually has repercussions out here. It undermines the sense of will. If you withdraw from Afghanistan when you only have 3,500 troops, you haven't lost a soldier in 18 months, and you're only spending $25 billion out of $850 billion, clearly you lack strategic patience. Yeah, I got it. It's frustrating. Our partners were far from perfect. Situations maddening. The Pakistanis don't help us. Again, I got it. It's a long war and all the rest of this, but we've had troops in Korea in the tens of thousands for 80 years or whatever it is, 70 plus years. Tens of thousands in Japan left over from World War II. Now they're very admirably positioned for the Indo-Pacific. And again, America doesn't really care as long as it's sustainable. And sustainability is, there's two metrics. It's expenditure of blood and the expenditure of treasure. So again, if you're not exceeding those, Vietnam, on the other hand, was unsustainable. There's just no way that could continue. By the way, we didn't even get the big ideas right there until 1968. Think about the French and a really bad big idea. They're frustrated they can't get the communists to come to battle, so they create a place called Dien Bien Phu, way out there, even almost at the edge of their air support. Let's go out there and they'll finally come to battle. And boy, did they ever. And of course, they lose, they have to surrender and they leave Indochina. But again, so let's think about the components of deterrence. In this case, we need to transform our forces more rapidly than we are. We are hardening them, improving their defenses, putting headquarters underground, dispersing our forces, reinforcing our allies and coalition partners. I actually think the administration has, and I'm non-political to all your viewers, and I criticize either party's administrations, and also will give them some kudos in certain cases. I think that they've done generally quite a good job. Kurt Campbell and company have done, I think, superbly in putting this together. As a glaring absence, which is the trade component. We never should have walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a pale carbon copy of a true trade agreement. Be that as it may, you need a comprehensive, integrated, whole of governments approach to China, all partners and allies together. But of course, the key component is the military component, but it's not the only component. Then think about the fact that in the Indo-Pacific, for the first time, I think we're going to operationalize an old adage that we used to repeat during the Cold War, but really wasn't operational. It was much more aspirational. And that is, what can be seen can be hit, what can be hit can be killed. And we couldn't see all that much in depth in the battlefield back when I was a major in the Inter-German Border Brigade operations officer. And if it was moving, we couldn't hit it very accurately. In the Indo-Pacific, you can see everything that's above the surface, and you can hit everything and you can kill it. Yes, we have defenses and all the rest, but again, it's much more problematic. So we have to transition from a small number of large, incredibly capable, but hugely costly and heavily manned platforms to a vastly greater number of much smaller unmanned systems, many of which will be remotely piloted, but which increasingly are going to be algorithmically piloted. And I'm not just talking about drone aviation drones here. I'm talking about maritime drones. I'm talking about surveillance systems on the bottom of the trench, attack systems on the bottom of that trench, driven by those surveillance systems. We're talking about undersea drones and robotics. We're talking about air, ground, space, cyberspace equivalent, if you will. They're already there. And again, increasingly, you're going to take the human out of the loop, as challenging as that it sounds ethically, and the human will be on the loop, the person who actually designs the software program, the algorithm, and establishes in that program the conditions that the unmanned system has to meet to carry out its assigned task, be it kinetic, non-kinetic, or what have you. So that's, I think, what we have to think about. The problem is that our military industrial congressional complex, as Senator McCain used to put it, each of those elements of that triad have vested interests in the legacy platforms. These are understandable. And again, the platforms are awesome. I loved having 2 complete carrier task forces in Central Command during the bulk of the time that I was the commander, in addition to 250,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. But we have to transform, because again, the vulnerability of these systems in an era of hypersonic, unmanned, maneuvering at the last minute systems is going to require us to do so. That, we hope, will shore up deterrence sufficiently that you name the scenario. And yes, there's a lot of other scenarios. There's, the quarantine, or they can do a blockade. They can take one of the little islands. Again, all of these have been thought through. And I think we have responses for them. But what we want is, of course, every single morning when the sun comes up in Beijing, the senior leader looks at the situation and says, okay, not today. And you just keep that going until there is a change in the nature of the relationship, which Jake Sullivan accurately has described as severe competition, and try to get back to something that is more mutually beneficial than what we have. Recognizing, by the way, they're still the #3 trading partner for the U.S. You cannot decouple from China, and but you can and should de-risk, and that's what we need to do.
Last question, because I know we're coming up against 10 o'clock. You are a maker of history. You are a teacher of history. But you're also a student of history, as I said before. And so I'm curious, in your research and writing for this book, what is an episode, an incident, an innovation, an adaptation, a lesson that even you learned for the first time, that even surprised you, and actually kind of looking through this?
Well, let me come back to where we started, which was the crucial component of strategic leadership. And so I already had this intellectual construct that I've described of the 4 tasks. I had that in mind from the moment that I took command of the surge. I'd sort of distilled that for myself out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, when I had 6 different hats for the Army, actually even a joint hat. Secretary Rumsfeld gave me said, create the Joint Center for International Security Force Assistance, report to the chairman for that one. So we had all these different roles. And I'd recognized, again, this construct. Again, you got to get the big ideas right. And in that case, it was to get the doctrine right and to get our instruction right and all the rest of that. You have to communicate it. That was through how we prepared forces, how we taught the staff college, all of our commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer professional courses. Then the implementation of them, it's how we practiced it there, but also how it was done on the battlefield. And then capturing the lessons. I oversaw the Center for Army Lessons, the Center for Leadership, all of the pre-command course, all these different entities, Battle Command Training, BCTP program, which did the Division Corps Command, the scenarios at the National Training Center for the Brigade Combat Team mission rehearsal exercises. So you control all of this, and it was essentially this framework. But then I'm doing it as the strategic leader for a military campaign in Iraq. So think of that, again, the importance of that. And for what it's worth, for those who are interested in getting more about this, we actually distilled this at the Belfer Center at Harvard. I was a fellow there for 6 years, non-resident, and a team of individuals who had actually worked for me in Iraq and Afghanistan sought to help me do this. And so if you go to belfercenter.org and search for Petraeus on strategic leadership, that'll pop up. And there's a lot more details in the tactics, techniques, and procedures of how you perform these tasks. And the rest of that in leadership in general are there as well. With that in mind, the episode that really jumped out at me was revisiting Vietnam. I had not visited Vietnam seriously since 10 years after, which is when I wrote my dissertation for the PhD at Princeton. And that was titled The American Military and the Lessons of Vietnam. And I was really focused more actually on the impact of Vietnam on military thinking and advice on the use of force, thinking that hopefully that might provide some illumination that I could draw on intellectual capital, maybe down the road if I actually continue to progress. And it obviously did. So when I revisited it with all the additional scholarship, and I'd been aware of this, but I'd not dug into it, the newly declassified papers, first at the 10-year mark, 25 and so forth. And all of a sudden you have a wealth of information that hadn't existed before. And it really struck me that we had failed to perform the first task of strategic leadership. Not really the White House. They'd had a framework that was adequate for a battlefield commander to have gotten the big ideas right, and huge resources and freedom of action and the rest of that. But we did not get the big ideas right. The Vietnamese actually asked us, when we started being the ones that would support them after the withdrawal of the French, to help them combat guerrillas and insurgents in the villages and hamlets. And we said, now, you need to worry about an invasion across the DMZ that's been established between North and South Vietnam in the peace agreement that ushered the French out. because that's what we just experienced in Korea. We overlearned the lessons of Korea. And so you need to build divisions. That's what you need that look just like ours, of course. It's ours of the highest evolution of military organizational structure. And that's what we insisted on building. And then we brought over big units. We made it a big war. We fought a war of attrition rather than a war focused on security and serving the people. We got it wrong. And we didn't get it right until 1968, when General Abrams took over from General Westmoreland, who, had counterinsurgency books on his desk, or on his bedside table. But one of his biographers said he doubted that he ever opened it, because the campaign, it gave lip service. It had some initiatives, and Cords came in, and you had strategic hamlets and others, but they never were really the focus of the campaign. They were always subordinate to and less important than the big war, the battalions, the brigades, the divisions. And by the way, that's where the up and comers went. They didn't go to the other war in Vietnam, as it was termed in Pete Dawkins' PhD dissertation at Princeton, the advisory effort, which in truth was more important, because that was building host nation capability. Yes, our partners were detached and almost disinterested in the plight of the peasants, different religion, language, shopping destination, Paris, not the villages and hamlets. But as I went back into this, it was just stunning how much we failed to get the big ideas right. And therefore, no matter how well you communicate, energy, inspiration, appearance, all of this, you're just not going to achieve success, because you're building on a shaky intellectual foundation. Abrams got it right. The problem was, of course, by that point in time, in the wake of Tet, the American public support had collapsed. It was getting worse and worse and worse. Ironically, so you have, for the first time, a commander who actually understands the nature of the war, which Clausewitz identified, of course, as the most important task for a commander is to do that. And then you have Nixon and Kissinger in the White House, which is sort of the dream team from a military commander perspective, willing to take certain risks, take actions that the previous administration had shrunk from doing. But because domestic public opinion was collapsing, and because of the unrest in the US, it just could not be remedied. Yes, it's even possible, had we gotten it all right, because of the deficiencies of the host nation leaders and the social context and all the rest of that, is possible. Even then, it might not have been successful, but it sure would have been a lot more successful than what we saw. And it's actually possible we might have been able to build sufficient capacity that they could have withstood what the North Vietnamese would do after we left. So I think that was the episode that really, obviously had a pretty good handle on Iraq and Afghanistan. Although, as I note, in Afghanistan, I really came to recognize that we didn't even get the inputs right in Afghanistan for 9 years after a brilliant initial campaign, whereby special forces on horseback and CIA officers with a footlocker of money and the Northern Alliance warlords and tribes were able to eliminate the Taliban, take them down, and also eliminate the Al-Qaeda sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned, albeit with Osama bin Laden getting away for the next 10 years until we tracked him down when I was the commander, and Admiral McRaven that night was working for the CIA. So those, I think, are that's the biggest of the big takeaways from my perspective.
Well, I'm sure if you have one takeaway from your own work, we have many, many, many from the book. And so I wanted to say again, congratulations on a great book. It should be on everybody's shelf. It's available via Amazon, USA Today, New York Times bestseller. And congratulations again to you and Lord Roberts. And thank you so much for spending an hour with us.
Thanks for the invitation. Always great to be with it.
All right, great. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you, General.